is the husband, I think. Okay. Well, good morning to everyone. As you know, we had a last-minute reorganization last week because the word I've been using is dimwit went to the wrong chapter last week, so we jumped ahead. So we skipped session 9. So we're doing session 9 this week and then session 11 next week. Okay. Well, it's a season for forgiveness, so I just want to impose on you generous thoughts. Now, what I have is on our page for session 9 is just some things that we should know by the time we get done with our session today, which is going to have some very heavy chart work. It says it could be worth your while to make some simple comparisons among these 3 texts, because what we're going to discuss is the gospel texts of Mark, first gospel, the year 70, Matthew, the year 80, Luke, the year 85. And it's going to be in the springtime or the January session, whenever we start next year. We will have another set of sessions, and at that time we will get heavily into the Gospel of John. So this is what we have for now. Remember, our theme is to identify elements of the afterlife. In other words, our cover text is this all there is? And it's true that this is not all there is. And we took a lot of materials from the scriptures of the Old Testament, and then we got into the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, and we're going to have our last session is going to be on texts from Paul. And they're all working on the same reality, which is what is life after death. Interestingly, the Jewish perspective for all those years from 1800 when Abraham, 1350 before Christ for Moses, these are rough dates, 1,000 years before would be King David, and then the other kings all the way down. Then the great Alexander the Great came through the whole area there and conquered the world in the year 300s. And so then they were under rule by various other groups in Israel. There are various other political and geographical entities. So anyway, with all of that in mind, it was only the last couple of hundred years before Christ, especially with the Maccabean revolt, where they come along and they see their young people who have died defending the Jewish onslaught and saying, well, how can God allow us to save the Jewish people and at the same time and not have some kind of reward for that, some kind of afterlife for that? And we're not talking Sheol, because Sheol is a dark and empty place. Oh my goodness. So then I have the 3 things, statements as what is the particular emphasis of Mark, what is the particular emphasis of Matthew, what is the particular emphasis of Luke. One thing we're going to notice is as we go through these texts is that Mark has 8 verses, Matthew has more, and Luke has a lot more, and John will have a lot more. So the expansion of the gospel writers is going to be imperative for us to understand that we're dealing with the time of Jesus' death, April 7th, year 30, up till the time of the Gospels. The reason that somebody would get into the scriptures as approved, as opposed to not approved, which there are numbers, is that they were approved by the apostles. So as the apostles are starting to die off, it is important that we have a kind of recollection of who Jesus was authentically. And if the apostles are not going to be around to stamp these things, then we better get at it. So I think that would be one of the reasons for developing a gospel. Another reason is that, especially in Rome, the first gospel takes place there. Mark is a disciple of Peter, and so he's questioning Peter all the time. And of course, he's got between the year 30 and the year 70 a lot of time to be able to discern what the major elements are. And he uses his genius, and truly a genius, to tell us about Jesus. And we're welcoming our people. Nice to have you join us here. Well, let's take a look at the first page that I have there for you. Page 1. It says Mark chapter 16. And you can see that there is a section. Of course, excuse, I don't mean to skip over my own, writing here. This, is like something you can go home with and read it all over again, and it'll be the substance of what we are doing today. So you'll notice that this was printed up wonderfully by people that did this for me, by taking these texts and putting them into columns so that we could actually have the actual text in front of us, as opposed to a full page thing where we wouldn't be able to fit it on the page, and then we'd have to, have a lot more pagings and stuff like that in here. So what we have here is the resurrection of Jesus. You can notice it only has 8 verses, and you can see that there are more verses there, 9 through the end of the work, 20. Those are added later on. So being a purist about scholarship, I cross those out because those are not part of Mark's writing. They are taking materials from other gospels and putting them into a conclusion to Mark's gospel, because Mark does not have a resurrection appearance of Jesus talking to somebody or meeting somebody that is similar to what you're going to find in Matthew and in Luke and in John. So that's why I cross it out, because it ruins the literary unity of the gospel, because the Gospel of Mark is based on the failure of discipleship. The failure of discipleship, including horrific abandonment of Jesus at the time he needed them the most. You've heard me say this both in homilies or in other type things, that when we read, for the past couple of weeks, we had this text from Mark both in the daily Mass and in the Sunday Mass, and it said that Jesus would need them. He gives an apocalyptic sermon. He says, you don't know when the master is going to come and knocking at the door, and you better be ready. And he says it's at evening time, or at midnight, or at the cockcrow, or dawn. So the Romans use a 3-hour time zone, their little hourglass, to measure their soldiers' commitment to guarding things. And so the gospel writer does that too. So at 9 o'clock on Holy Thursday night, what happens? Judas walks out the door and go off to betray Jesus. They didn't need Judas because Jesus is a very public figure, and it's nighttime, and it's easy to follow somebody walking at nighttime. And it's about an hour plus, or even a little bit more, from the place of the Last Supper down across the bottom of the city of Jerusalem, up through the Kedron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. So they call it, John calls it the garden. The synoptics call it Gethsemane, which is a word for olive press. It was owned, parts of it were owned by Mark's family, by the way, and that's why they're headed out there. The size of the city would double or even triple because of the Passover feast. So what happens there is at 9 o'clock, Judas leaves. What happens at midnight? 3 disciples, the beloved ones, Peter, James, and John, fall asleep. Jesus needs them. What is cockcrow? Well, that's when the soldiers come in the middle of the night. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and they arrest Jesus. And what happens to them? We read chapter 14, verse 50. They all fled. One of them even grabbed his garment, and he runs off naked. So which has its own meaning. And then at the morning, at 6 o'clock in the morning, what happens there? Well, Peter comes to the place of Annas and Caiaphas. He gets in the door there, and they ask him, aren't you one of those people with that man? He said, no. And three times, the favorite number of the Gospels, three times he says, no, I swear I don't know the man. So here you've got an outline of the failure of the disciple at the most critical of times. So the resurrection text is going to have some element of that, because of the fact that the last line has brought some scholars to confusion, but not to me or the other people who are think along these lines. And that is that when the women come to the tomb and they're named, and they're going to do the proper burial rites, because the burial rites were accelerated by the fact that the sun was going down. And when the sun goes down, a new day begins, and that day would be the Sabbath. Friday night is the Sabbath, Saturday. So, and then Saturday at darkness, that becomes Sunday. So Jesus in the tomb 3 days. He goes in on the Friday. The Sabbath is the Saturday, and the Sunday morning is the Sunday. So what you have is the women coming to the tomb, and they find that the tomb is closed in their minds as they're going, and they're saying, "Who's going to open it for us?" Some people say that one of the burial modes was a great big huge circle wheel of stone, and they would roll that into the ground into a groove. And so when it came into the groove, it settled in, and so it became very hard to just roll it as if it were standing on flat land. So anyway, they have this question, and they're bringing the spices. Remember, in the beautiful account of the Magi in Matthew's Gospel, trying to identify things with past Judaism and stuff like that, they bring the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Myrrh is the powder that they're going to use to sprinkle onto the body to give it some kind of odor removal and dignity. Also, from the Shroud of Turin, in the last 30 years, the botanical scientists have done little vacuuming jobs on the Shroud of Turin, and they have found there some seeds or elements of flowers. So it could be that they brought some flowers, like we do at funerals, but these would be thrown on the body too for the same reason, to make it more glorified, if you want. So they're coming with that intention. And then what happens, very early, the sun had risen, and they came to the tomb. And they say, well, who's going to roll this back for us? Now, you have to remember this about Mark's Gospel. It is terse. It is very much object-oriented. It is not something that has the parables like Luke does, the beautiful parables, prodigal son, so or the great sermons of Matthew. Mark doesn't have those. He only has 1,000. He has 660 some verses, whereas the other Gospels are much beyond that. So anyway, when they looked up, they saw the stone had been rolled back, was very large. On entering the tomb, they saw a man sitting on the right side, clothed in a white robe. Well, these are code words for an angel, some visitor from heaven is down there to speak with them. So this doesn't leave us too much to try to figure out. So he said, "Don't be amazed, you seek Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified." I see how beautiful this writing is of Mark, because he's just right to the point. He says, Jesus was crucified, and he's been raised. So to throw three little statements there that really get to the whole issue, that Jesus goes through death into the newness of life, eternal life. He's been raised. Behold the place where they laid him. They show him if things are correct. This is outside the gate of Jerusalem. A further gate would be built in the year 44, and that would include the area of the crucifixion. So the Protestants want to say that the Holy Sepulchre is not the right place because it was inside the city. Well, no, they should pay attention to the archaeologists that other wall was built in the year 44. So there is a wall there. Jesus walks through it from the Praetorium, which is the Mark Antony's name is on it, the Antonia, and it is the place where the Pilate and the other people come. He would bring several legions with him. Legions those days had about 600 members. So he would have one on horseback and one, because it's going to be a major feast, and he wants to have a lot of power. And so anyway, when they get there, they see the stone had been rolled back. The man in white tells them he's not here. Then remember, if we read the entire Gospel of Mark, and you'll find at the Last Supper, Jesus said, he continuously says 3 times over on the march to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer and die, be handed over, suffer and die. Tribitorai is the great word there, handed over. So he's going to do that. And he says, and then I will meet you in Galilee. Go there. Now, what is the purpose of that? Well, I'll just jump right into it, even though we haven't even finished reading the text. that Galilee is not only a geographical place. You say, oh yes, I know where Galilee is. It's north. We're in Jerusalem, which is in the south. No, the whole region of Galilee is also theological, spiritual. By that I mean that when Jesus, the man here is telling them exactly what Jesus says, go to Galilee, I will speak to you there. It is a beautiful spirituality because Galilee is where all the miracles take place, and the sermons and the healings and the prayers and the nights with the Father. He just spends the whole night with communing with the Father, and all these things take place in Galilee. So Galilee is actually this very room right here, right now, is Galilee. Why? Because the work of Christ is being continued. We're reflecting on the Christ message, and so this is Galilee. In other words, Galilee becomes the theological, spiritual place where the church exists, where Jesus exists in time and place. And so don't think of it just as a geographical reference. It's not. Mark will have this appearance hinted at because that's where Jesus will meet them. And Matthew's gospel tells us that exactly, that Jesus met with them in Galilee. And John's gospel has the same thing. Luke doesn't put those elements in because he wants to emphasize Jerusalem as the holy city. So remember, Luke wrote 2 books. One book was the gospel that ended up in Jerusalem. All the things were in Jerusalem. It's the nub of the universe. And then he writes a second book, which is the Acts of the Apostles. And guess where that ends up? In Rome. That now becomes the center of the universe. Why? Because, well, Peter is there and the church is there. So anyway, so let's continue to read. It says, now don't be afraid. Tell his disciples and Peter. Now the reason for that is just not only is Mark a disciple of Peter, but he continuously, as the other synoptics do, mentions Peter's name, because he is going to be the one in Matthew's gospel. If you go to chapter 14 or chapter 16, what's going to happen is here are the keys of the kingdom, you, Peter. See, his name was Simon, but his name now is changed to Peter, Petra, both in the Hebrew and in the Greek have that meaning of a rock. So Jesus is saying, you are now the rock on which I will build my church. So Peter becomes a notoriety, and he's mentioned all over the place. Interestingly, the Gospel of John, which talks about the beloved disciple, we covered some of these things in our last presentations last year. So the beloved disciple is the person who is with Jesus. And it's kind of like an open-ended thing. It's like parentheses with nothing in it except ourselves. We put ourselves in it. So when we get to the Gospel of John, he doesn't mention the word apostle at all in the Gospel. Everybody's a disciple. And so he doesn't emphasize Peter as much as he does emphasize the person who will hear first that Jesus has risen from the dead will be Mary Magdalene. So it's a great treasure that we have in these different Gospels with their perspectives. So they went out anyway, having been told to go to Galilee. Then they went out and fled from the tomb. Now see, it says they fled. Well, why would they do that? You say, well, because they want to get back and tell everybody. That's one part of it. But on the other part of it is they want to get away from there because they think, oh, this is something has happened, something dramatic. And what do we do? We're not going to sit here all day and just look at an empty tomb. So they are trembling and bewildered. So they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. End of the gospel. Now, the reason I say that is significant is because all the way through the gospel, it's been difficult to figure out who Jesus is. And the disciples, even though they're told 3 times over on the way to Jerusalem that he's going to be handed over, crucified, and rise, they're talking about other things, like which one of us is going to be the head of the kingdom, which one of us is going to get what kind of a job, who's going to have all this kind of stuff going on. In fact, in one of the Gospels, we have the mother of James and John go to Jesus and say, I want my 2 kids, to be one on your right and one on your left. So they're thinking about all the, here Jesus is saying that you must be like a little child, which is innocent and pure and dedicated to the future. And what they're looking at is themselves. So the only person besides the demons know who Jesus is right away in chapter 1. Oh, Jesus, what are you trying to do? Are you going to hurt us? We know who you are. Remember in the chapter 5, what happens? He goes to a place where a man is in chains in a cemetery because he's obviously got some kind of major psychological, spiritual problems, and he's all chained up. And Jesus frees him, and he takes it because the demons are there. The demons say, we know who you are. And Jesus puts him into the pigs. which is unusual. So you have pigs there. This is the Decapolis, the Greek area. So and what do? They run into the sea. Why is that? Because that's where the demons kind of congregate, is in the sea. Anytime you hear the Lake Galilee, you know that it's just a lake. But when you hear the Sea of Galilee, it is the place where the demons are. How do I have an example for that? Yes, Jesus is out in the boat, is asleep in the back of the boat, his head on a cushion. Mark likes to have these little market details, head on a cushion, so you get kind of a "you are there" type feeling. And all of a sudden, this huge storm comes up, which is not unusual, and it wants to sink this ship. Well, the ship stands for the church, and Peter stands for, the continuity of the leadership of the church, all the way down to our present Pope Francis. So what you have is this tossing about, and they have to wake Jesus up, and he said, "Well, what's your problem? Don't you have faith? I'm not going to let you go under." So this became a kind of a symbol for the early church. They call it the bark, B-A-R-Q-U-E, a French word, bark of Peter, the ship of Peter. That's why if you go to any of the great cathedrals, they're all named for Mary, by the way. But if you go to the great cathedral, especially the one at Chartres, was one of the first. St. Denis up in the Paris was one of the second. And anyway, as you walk in, what do you see? You see several things. One is it's a long building, and it's got outriggers on it. Outriggers are, elements on the side of it. They call it flying buttresses. They need that to take the weight of going up another flight so that they can have a tall church, because all the other churches had a flat roof. They were Romanesque. See, but this invention in the 1000s of the church with these buttresses is profound. So what does it look like if you're up from the moon looking down? What does it look like? You see this long building, and you see all these things out on the side. What do you think of? Like you're rowing a boat. And what do they call the section of the church, the center section church? The nave. Navis, the Latin word and Greek word, navis, for ship. So, and right in the middle, by the way, since I'm talking about this, you could watch National Geographic and get the same description, but mine's much more accurate. And so what they have is a large circle there. And a large circle is one of these things where you start and you walk around and back and forth and back and forth, back and forth. So it's a way to pray. There was one guy who was there. One guy he was upset because the lady in front of him was walking too slow. I mean, you come all the way to Chartres to get to this circle so that you can walk it slowly and pray, and you're moaning about. So anyway, that's an aside you won't find in National Geographic. So anyway, what we have is this. That is the womb. So you walk in, and like 2/3 of the way from the front down, not from the entranceway, is the womb. So with the gestation of Jesus. Okay, so now what we've done is we've covered Mark's gospel, and now what we're going to do is take Matthew's gospel. See, it's on the lower right-hand side, and Matthew's gospel of the resurrection of Jesus. They come, and these various names come up in these things. If you figured out all the women who accompanied Jesus, which was a large entourage, but they're one after another, they get named at various places. I think I counted up one time eight of them, several Marys in there, Mary the wife. So, the Protestants say, well, Mary was not a virgin because she gave birth to a child, and she had a bunch of other brothers and sisters, because that's what they call them. Well, in those days, anybody after your second cousin was a brother or sister. But there was a Mary who was the mother of James and Joseph, a different one. And so that was the Mary they're talking about. So I don't know how they can miss that, So anyway, there was a great earthquake, and Matthew is into this because what he's going to do, this is very intricate. He's going to use some material from the Apocalypse and bring it into as if it were happening with Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, you say that's not fair, because what he's doing is he's making it up. What I'm telling you is he has a theological purpose for bringing in some things from the Apocalypse, from the Revelations. And what is the thing that he's going to emphasize? Massive earthquakes and lightning and thunder and stuff. This is appropriate for the death of Jesus, to have the world in turmoil. And the next thing they're going to have happen is people are going to come up out of graves. They say, well, did that happen? And I'm going to tell you, no, not at that time. But that's not the point. The point is to be able to read the gospel intelligently, which is that what he's doing is telling you that at the time of Jesus' resurrection, there's going to be people accompanying him who are coming out of the tombs. Because that's what happens when Jesus goes through death into new life. It means all the people alive up to that point have that opportunity as well, and all the people to come, ourselves included, have that moment. I just tell you that. So and there were guards there. Apparently, this was part of the mythology of the time that the leaders were afraid that somebody's going to come and take the body because they heard all this resurrection talk, and so they had soldiers out there. So they became like dead men. Then the angel says, "Don't be afraid. Are you looking for Jesus? The crucified, he's not here. He's been raised, just as he said he would. Come see the place where he lay." Now we turn the page. "Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he's been raised. He's going before you to Galilee, and you will see him. Behold, I have told you." Now, what this indicates is that Matthew is taking material from Mark and adding to it, because what he does is he takes a good portion of Mark's gospel in his own words. Matthew does. So Luke does the same thing. So about 2/3 of Matthew's gospel is Markan material, and about 1/3 of Luke's material. So when they're writing their gospels, they're relying on this gospel that was written in Rome in the year 70. And so anyway, then they go away quickly, and behold, Jesus met them on the way. So now we got a meeting of Jesus, and he meets with the women. "And don't be afraid, go tell my brothers, go to Galilee." We've already covered that. While they were going, some of the guard went in the city, and they came back, and they got bribed and said, "Oh yeah, somebody stole the body. Yeah, we were there. We were awake all night long, and yeah, they stole the body." A friend of mine who's in the papers a lot these days, Ed Burke. His father was a Chicago politician and a policeman at the same time. And so Ed Burke became a policeman when he was studying law, and his job was to sit in his car, the squad car, outside the front of the Mayor Daley's residence through the night, so that there'd be a guard there. So somebody, nice job. So you say, why do I mention all that? I have no idea. Things just flash in and out of my mind, and since it's there's a large open space there, so that they can bounce around quite a bit. He says, so anyway, I'm going down to verse 16. "The disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them." So these are the final moments then of Jesus with us, and it doesn't tell us about an ascension as such. It just ends with Jesus' statement. So you see how bare this is, kind of compared to the later ones of Luke and John. At the same time, it's an expansion of what Matthew expands a little bit on what Mark had. He says, now they worshipped him, but they doubted. See, this is, you say, oh, I know he got that from Mark's gospel, because in Mark's gospel they have this confusion. It's only when they meet the risen Jesus that they're actually convinced of everything. And on Pentecost Sunday, which is 7 times 7 plus 1, Pentecost, originally a grain feast, now the feast to celebrate Moses' laws, and for the Christians becomes the birthday of the church. So when they on Pentecost, then the Holy Spirit is given to them, and they're changed completely. They know exactly who Jesus is. He's the one who died and rose. So anyway, now what we should do is go to the Old Testament and go to Daniel 7:14. And Daniel 7:14 has this image of a white bearded guy, with a long white beard, and kind of a figure that we would anticipate God the Father, in the cartoons or in the movies and stuff like that. So anyway, the Ancient of Days, he's called, the Ancient of Days. He sits on a throne. And then comes before him the Son of Man. This is all in Daniel. Daniel's writing in the 500s before Christ. So anyway, Daniel says that the Son of Man comes. Well, we know who that is, Jesus. So Jesus is approaching the Father. So what does the Father say to Jesus? What you are to do is to have all the authority over things heavenly and earthly. And you will have a kingdom that will last forever. So what Jesus does is he's going to quote that meeting in the prophet Daniel, and he's going to add to it like this. in verses 19, 18, 19, and 20 is his final thoughts. And listen to, and you can just see Daniel at work here. Jesus' approach says, all power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now, in Matthew's gospel, the entire gospel is ordained towards shifting the power from Jesus to his disciples. That's why in chapter 10, he sends them out to do miracle things. In chapter 14, 16, and other places, he's going to tell Peter he's the rock on which the church is going to be built. So what happens is Jesus is taking the authority that he has given in this Daniel approach, and he's given it to his disciples. So he said, go therefore make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Teach them to observe all I've commanded you. Behold, I'm with you always till the end of the age. Isn't that something? Beautiful. Here's something more interesting to the exegete, that is a person who studies scripture for other things besides just the message. I want to see how the gospel is put together. There are 10 statements in that phraseology that Jesus just executed there, 10 phrases. And each one of those phrases is mentioned in the 5 great sermons that he has. Now, he has 5 great sermons because of the fact that the Pentateuch had 5 books. And what Jesus does is he replaces Moses. Moses was the key figure in their spirituality as a man of God up until the time of Jesus. David gets in there too, but this is Jesus. And so what Jesus does is he takes and the way Matthew does it is he is sure to mention each one of these phrases in each one of those 5 great sermons. You say, I thought the number was supposed to be 7 for perfection. That's why there's 2 small sermons, one at the beginning and one at the end. This is the one at the end. So you get 7. I could go on forever. Well, excuse me, for a long time. Now we're going to get to Luke. Now Luke, as you can notice here, goes down the whole page, and then to take a look at the next page, he's got a whole page there. Oh my goodness. So Luke has an incredible amount of material here. Yes, and it's beautiful writing. And so what we have is kind of a reprise of what went on in Mark and Matthew. They went out early in the morning, they saw the stone rolled away, but then the Son of Man must be handed over. So go to Galilee. Then they returned from the tomb. They announced all the things. These were the women, Mary, I'm at verse 10, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, others who accompanied them, but they didn't believe them. As you might know, and I'm just the messenger, so don't take it out on me, but in those days, women were not accepted as witnesses. So if you went to court, it was always a manly thing. So anyway, that's just the anthropology at the time. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, went and saw the burial cloths there, and went home amazed. Then what we have is this long portion, starting at verse 13, all the way down to the bottom of the next page, and up to verse 35. That whole page is the road to Emmaus. Emmaus is a small town about 7 miles from the city. And and I said mass there one time. And they meet somebody, but they don't recognize him. Now this is, everything is exquisite here. How can you not recognize somebody, especially Jesus the Lord? And these are disciples. Now I take this as a married couple, by the way. I take this as on the road to Emmaus, that we get the name of the gentleman, Cleopas, but at an earlier time we had seen that his wife was named, and so I'm going to say that this is a husband-wife team. And so anyway, they say, why aren't you, our stranger, depressed about the things that happened there? About everybody must know about what happened to Jesus. And then Jesus starts to explain the scriptures to them. Now there's many layers to this whole gospel text. One of the layers is what happened. Another one of the layers is the beauty of not recognizing Jesus, because of the fact that recognition is not just physical sight, but the deeper form of recognizing Jesus is from the spiritual sense, that you adore Jesus, that you love Jesus, that you see. If Jesus was walking down the streets of Jerusalem at that time, then nobody would have recognized or anything like that. So with these this couple does is they have to sharpen their recognition of Jesus. It's more important to see Jesus with faith than it is to see Jesus in the person of the resurrection, which could be confusing. So anyway, he explains scriptures to them. Would you like to have heard that? All the scriptures. It's like the stuff we were reading, that prepared us for this event. And what happens as a result of this event is that the explanation that Jesus gives kind of points us to the whole continuity from Judaism into its sprig, which would be Catholicism. And then they go inside and he breaks bread with them. And in breaking of the bread, they recognize him. See how beautiful this is? So this is the subterranean level here, which is really the greatest level. What is happening is Luke is telling you this is what they did in the early church. They would gather, they would have a meal in somebody's home. There are estimates that in some of these towns, like in Antioch, I'll take Antioch of Syria, up on the corner, one of the 4 largest cities, they probably had about 20, at least 20 identifiable collections of peoples that would get together, sometimes for the Sabbath, but all the time for communion. And so what they would do is they would meet at somebody's home. They would be like this, there are people there that are of wealth and substance. So so they would get together. They would gather. One of them is a quote unquote priest bishop anointed as such by Paul or one of the other apostles would do this ordination by laying on of hands. It's still the ritual today. Nothing is said about now you're a priest or anything like that. It's just the bishop puts hands on your head, and the other members of the presbytery come and they put the hands on the head. So that's how a person is ordained. So then they would, after their meal, then they would gather, and someone, usually the bishop, would tell of something of Jesus. And they would either talk about his parables, his speeches, his miracles, this, that, the other thing, but they would give a kind of a report on why they are here celebrating this communion is because Jesus was with us and did these things. Then he will go into what we have as the Eucharistic prayer. On the night before he died, Jesus took and broke the bread, gave it to his disciples and said, take this, this is my body. He says, do this in memory of me. So everybody would say yes, and they would come forward. They would have brought bread with them and then put it on the table in front. It would have been consecrated then, and then they would take a portion of it, and that was their communion, and same with the wine that was there. And so what they're doing is celebrating the Mass. So what we have here is Jesus is kind of in the Gospel of Luke is so clever to point this out to us. What Jesus is doing is like celebrating Mass with them, which he did at the Last Supper, and then now he's doing it again. And so they run back and they tell the disciples. The next column over on the right-hand side is in Luke's framework here, is exactly what I've been talking about, which is they were amazed at what Jesus was telling them. Their hearts were burning within them. And so then what he does, they run back and they go into the upper room there. And who do they meet again but Jesus? And Jesus is talking with them. He had appeared to Peter, apparently. That's codified for us. And then now he eats with them. Now this is the gospel that mentions that he has something to eat with them, because the reigning philosophy of the Mediterranean at that time was Platonism, from Plato, student of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Plato was kind of basically a spiritual, Pope Benedict called him the fifth gospel, sort of a spiritual writer. What he said was that we are organized to major truths, 4 of them: the good, the power of love, all of the things that come. So why did Socrates himself go through death? He could have just, they arrested him. Usually what that meant was get out of town, but he doesn't. He says, no, I'll die. He says, why? Because then when I die, I will be in the realm of truth. If you go to Plato's book, The Republic, chapter 6, let's try to act this out here. This will be a group of people seated on top of a large stone plateau, okay? And behind them is a fire. And up in front of them is images of shadows that are made by the fire in this cave. The cave is dark. The light behind them catches and makes a shadowy figure up front on like a screen. Am I making some sense? That what you're getting is an image up in the front, but it's not people that are dancing up front. It's people that are dancing out here, but their image is out there. Well, that's what Plato thinks that this life is, that we are all kind of in the shadow. And so what he wants for us to do is to go into the eternal truths. And in doing so, we will have the fulfillment of what it is to be alive. That's what Plato is thinking. So what we're dealing with here is, and Paul especially would have been educated in Platonism because of the fact that he was highly educated, and that was kind of one of the things that went around. So Jesus eats with them to show them that he is not a shadow. This is not a ghostly appearance. How about John's gospel with Thomas not there? Thomas says he loved Jesus so much. He was so courageous. He even wanted to go to Jerusalem with Jesus. if Jesus is going to be crucified, then he wants to be there too. He wants, so anyway. But he's not there. Why? Well, because of the fact that he says, you can't be telling me that you saw Jesus and, you love Jesus so much. We all did. And so you don't want to lose him. So what you do is you say, and don't we say this often? Say, well, his memory will last on. They just had a White Sox ball player died, Allen, and one of the phrases they had there in the commentary on it was, he said, but his influence will last for a long time, even though he was like 20 years ago, because he was such a vivacious and leadership type person. So anyway, that's what Thomas is saying. I know that you're heartbroken that Jesus has died and was buried, but you're not going to try to tell me that he's around. I'm not going to buy that. This is my kind of way of looking at this. Why would Thomas, always people say the doubting Thomas, kind of a dullard. Just the opposite. I think he was very, very sharp, and he had this psychological attitude towards him. But I'm not going to fall into the trap of thinking that Jesus will accompany us in spirit. And so that's why he says, I got to see this. So anyway, that's why Jesus is eating here in the Gospel of Luke. So these are the Gospel texts. So what we have done is we've gone through the Jewish texts of hinting at resurrection. We've gone through some of the writings of Paul, a little bit out of sequence, because the person who was giving the program last week didn't know that we were supposed to be doing chapter 9 that time, and instead we did chapter 10. And so anyway, he got fired, and they went to the bench. And so I came in off the bench. So what we're going to do then is take a look now at a more kind of structural pattern. And this is going to require a lot of attention, too much for us for today. You can see that this is the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament, and it's by a Jesuit, Felix Eust. And I was telling Stephanie that I met him and he met me on the bus out on the West Coast some 10 years ago. I already knew of his name because he does this kind of work. He doesn't give a book like commentary or something like Bishop Barron would, to give you a sermon. What he does is he analyzes the structure of things, which is pretty much my basic insight into scriptures, to study the composition factor and to appreciate it. Because people think, well, what they are is a collection of stories. You just put one story, then you get to another story, then to another story, and that becomes his story. So, but that's, you got to take these examples of creativity as being outstandingly clever. Mark's gospel, for example, has in chapter 1 up through chapter 3, verse 6, has 5 argument stories. 5 argument stories. You say 5, oh, that's going to be a number. He's going to make a pyramid out of them. By a pyramid, I mean he takes the first story and then the last story. They kind of parallel each other. And then he takes the second story and kind of parallels the fourth story. And then the center part is the third story. And so if you want to know the story, it's not like an Agatha Christie novel, you find out in the last 3 pages who did it. The butler always gets named, no, what he does, we're not working linearly like this. We're working towards a center. And in that center is this passage. Jesus has this argument. Why don't you fast, Jesus? And Jesus says, when you have the bridegroom with you, you do not fast, but you celebrate. He says there will be a time when the bridegroom won't be with you. Then you can fast. Now they know exactly what that means, is that Jesus is calling himself to be the covenantal husband, if you want. Go to the book of Revelation. I saw the New Jerusalem coming out of the heavens dressed as a bride for her husband. So the people of God are the bride and God is the husband. So this is a way of understanding life. And so what he's saying is that he himself now is the divine one. And so what do they do after these 5 stories are over with? The center story tells, the magnitude of the blasphemy that he has stated. In chapter 3, verse 6, what happens? They met, the Herodians did, with the Pharisees. Herodians are political, Pharisees religious, to plot Jesus' death. So this is in chapter 3, verse 6 of the gospel, is they're plotting his death because he's identifying himself as being the divine one. So that's a structural approach. Now, anyway, I met this Father Hughes. We were going to be invested, both of us together, which was a nice honor, into the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a order of people, goes back to the year 1000 in the Crusades. So, not many of those people were around, and they don't. This is not a priest organization. They need priests for ceremonies, but it's basically a layman and a laywoman's situation. There's 2 of these orders. The other is the Hospitallers, or the Knights of Malta, who do a lot of things about healing in hospitals and things like that. The Knights of the Holy Sepulchre from the United States sponsor some 40 schools in the Mideast, especially in Israel and Jordan, for education. And they're about 2/3 Catholic, for the few Catholics that are left, and 1/3 Muslim go to these schools because they're such excellent schools. Well, anyway, so that was a digression. Do you feel better now? Okay, you want to get back to work? Oh, all right, let's do that. Now, what he has here is, you can see he has terms and definitions. So he's going to talk about resurrection, and then he's going to talk about what resurrection is not. Then he's going to talk about eternal life versus mortal life. He's going to talk about the ascension. Then he's going to talk about the resurrection of the body. And then on the next page, he's going to have the early stages of understanding in the Old Testament about the resurrection, the Middle Ages, which would be Isaiah, and then the latest ages, which would be the books of wisdom. So in other words, there's a growth as you go through these 3 stages. This is on the next page there, page 7. And as there's 3 stages of growth. One is that there's a hint in all these readings. Well, we did that, especially Ecclesiastes. We read that and said there is no, it's like the book of Job. There is no life after death. We die, and that's it. Then the middle stages would be right around the time of the 3 famous prophets: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Do you notice that we're reading from Isaiah every day? In the scriptures for the daily mass, and also for the 3 Sundays of Advent. Last Sunday, this present Sunday, just a day ago, and then and next Sunday is going to be Isaiah. So anyway, so you see what he's trying to do. So let's take a look at some of these definitions. Resurrection, and it comes from the Latin resurgere, to rise again. So Jesus is the subject of his own action. He will rise from the dead. In other passages, it says he will be raised from the dead. What's the difference? Well, in one, it is Jesus who rises from the dead. It's his action. He does it. And the other is a further explanation, which is the Holy Spirit is the one who brings Jesus out of the tomb. That's a little known aspect of things, isn't it? It says he has been raised, as if it's some external power that does that. Well, you have to remember, we're dealing with the Trinity here now. So Jesus' death is death to this life in his mortal existence. He has died. That Jesus is no longer here. The Gospel of John helps us with that. Mary Magdalene comes along, and she kneels down in front of Jesus. She wants to hold on to him. And Jesus says in the Latin, it's a famous phrase in Latin, nolo me tangere, don't touch me. You think, oh, that's sensitive. You think they want to have a big hug or something like that. No, what he's talking about is, I'm not the Jesus of history. I am the Jesus of the risen state. So he says, don't hold on to me as if I was, quote unquote, resuscitated to the same existence that I had before. You see how that works? See, when you look at the next section down here, see it says the resurrection is not resuscitation. Resuscitation means you come back to what you were. Were there resuscitations in the Gospels? Yes. In the Gospel of Luke, there is the widow's son is brought back to life. In Mark's Gospel, there is the little girl, Talitha Koum, rise, in chapter 5. And of course, in John's Gospel, Lazarus. So these are resuscitations. The resuscitation of Lazarus takes 44 verses to present. 44. That is a long series of things, isn't it? And is it all about Lazarus? Au contraire. It's not about Lazarus. Only in the very last verse does he come out of the tomb. It says, then Lazarus came out of the tomb wrapped in his burial cloths. Why has he got his burial cloths on? Well, because he's dead. And now he's alive, and he hasn't had a chance to unwrap. Spiritually, though, it comes down to this. He's going to need those burial shrouds again. He is resuscitated, meaning he was brought back to the life that he had before, but he's not gone into eternal life. He's not a ghost or anything. Do you see the difference? So resuscitation, reanimation. This is kind of from the heritage of India, that you can come back, and live your soul, but now in a different body or a different existence. Reincarnation, the rebirth of a soul into a new and different, but still physical and mortal body. So reincarnation, these are all Latin words. And immortality. Immortality means that you are going to have life forever. So this is a soul that gets separated from a dead body. So immortality means you cannot die anymore. So then we get eternal life, which is life with God forever, not interrupted by death. Either continues or starts anew. Mortal life, normal human life, ending in death. Any life subject to suffering, death, and decay. Ascension is the return of a person after life on earth to live with God in heaven. There are some figures like this. Enoch is there, but in the book of Genesis. And Elijah is taken up into heaven, remember that? And of course, we're going to have in the Acts of the Apostles, we're going to have the ascension of Jesus. The assumption of Mary is not given to us in Scripture, it's given to us in tradition. So Christians believe in the resurrection of the body, not immortality. In other words, we do not believe that there is a soul. I was attending a funeral. One of the teachers at Carmel Catholic High School was a Jewish businessman who had 2 companies and stuff like that. And he did that until he got to be about 50 years old. And he said, enough of that. He says, I want to do what I really want to do, teach. So he went back, got a master's degree in education. And he came to knocking on my door. And so I hired him. And a wonderful gentleman. He was the president of their synagogue in Highland Park. His father died. So a group of us from school, which would be our usual thing, went to the funeral. And we go to the funeral, and in a Jewish synagogue, it's much like a theater. And so there's no pews or anything like that. And there's not even a podium. Maybe there is a podium in some of them. I belong to I was living in Arizona for a year and a half, helping out our school down there. And I went to the synagogue on Fridays. So anyway, this gentleman, his father died. The rabbi gave a talk on how his soul lives forever. That's unusual, but it's a statement from them. The soul lives forever. Well, that's straight out of the book of Plato and his philosophy. It's not saying that he will have a risen body, whereas our faith is, and this is in our creed, we believe in the resurrection of the body. So that's what that's our difference. So a dear friend of mine died. I think I've mentioned this several times. Just this last June, she was a survivor of the Holocaust. And they had the burial up in one of the north suburbs, and Jewish cemetery. So they had the grave all dug out. They had the body there. You could view it from a distance in the funeral home, only from a distance. And it was quick. It wasn't like a waiting for long days. They do the burials right away. And the rabbi gave a talk, and his talk didn't mention, afterlife or soul or anything. He just said, well, what we have to do is realize in this life that we die. So I think he was making the conclusion that, we die, and that's it. So the question is that all there is? I'm thinking he would say, yes, that's all there is. She lived a beautiful life. She gave of her genius to do things, to help out understanding the Holocaust and stuff. My goodness. I'll just tell you one. I don't know if I told this before. When they took all the Jews of Hungary, 440,000, and they pushed them up into the north. We saw that in a newspaper article that we had. And her family was there with 100 of them, and 6 survived. She survived because she was 17 years old. She arrived in Auschwitz on her birthday. But I'm not making light of this, but what you can see is flames coming up out of these giant chimneys, and stuff like that, as they were taking ashes of bodies and stuff like that up in the heavens. So anyway, kind of a deadly aura about the camp. And she said that I had some friends who wanted to see the museum. So we went into the museum, and she met us there, and they have one of those trains, those are prized possession now. I know out in Arizona they had people, the kids were throwing all their pennies in, and so they bought one. They bought one of those cars that was in a stockyard in Poland and stuff like that. And so they brought it to, so they had their own memento of the Holocaust. Well, they have one at the museum up there. So she said she stood for 3 days. Couldn't sit down anywhere. Why not? Well, because you're pressed in too much. There's room for some people to sit down. Her parents sat down, but that was about it. There's one bucket for waste. There was one bucket for water, but that was gone. And so one of my friends was there. Now here is a woman who spent that time in one of these railway cars, and they're not the big ones that we see now. Big long ones and big wide ones. Stuff. They're smaller, and so they were jammed in there. A couple hundred people jammed in. And so one of them said, well, what did you think about for 3 days? First of all, you're not fed. You can't, squat down or something like that. It's just not, it's just horrible. And she says, I can't remember a thing about it. Isn't that something? She was mercifully, her mind passed out. She couldn't, explain, what went on. And she wasn't trying to just avoid the question. You think, well, what would we do? I don't know, say the rosary, hope for the best, kind of look for open space or whatever. But so anyway, so that's what we're dealing with here, is that there is, on the bottom of this page there, it says, the main point is that we will still be somebody able to interact in personal relationship with God and with everybody else. This is kind of starting to open a avenue of exploration for us, which we're going to do, in our next sessions in January, February, March, whatever, is to figure out exactly what it is like. You see the movies, and you see people, famous Walt Disney movies and stuff like that. So, okay, now on the right-hand side, which is the next page, page 7, you have these stages of understanding about the resurrection. So I just point that out to you. Belief in the resurrection from death to a new and different form of life is in the New Testament, and they give 2 statements here. One is from 1 Corinthians 15. Paul explains that the spiritual and perishable body will be different from the physical perishable body, as a plant differs from a seed. And Mark chapter 12:25, for when they rise from the dead, they are like angels in heaven. So it's a different form of life. that the angels in heaven kind of is mysterious, because when we think of angels, we think of vaporous kind of realities. We don't think of somebody with fingernails and shoes and things like that. So, we think of some kind of a ghostly kind of appearance. The way that the gospel deals with this is helpful, but Paul's comment, I think, is very, very illustrative, because what he says is, if you take a seed and you plant the seed into the ground, it becomes something much more magnificent in magnitude. If you put an acorn into the ground, it is not going to grow up to be a big acorn. It's going to be a magnificent oak tree. And oak trees can go up to the sky, and they're very solid. So they have experimented and find out that trees talk. And you have to listen very carefully, because what happens is if they're in a dry spell and the tree's not getting enough, it makes some kind of a scratching kind of something or other that is discernible to the very sensitive little cameras or whatever they have to pick up sound. You're saying, why don't you be real about this and quit telling us fantasies? Well, okay, I'll stop there. But so now Jesus uses that same image. If you go to John chapter 12, right after the Lazarus scene, he's in Jerusalem, and some Greeks come to him, which means that they're not Jewish, and said, what will happen to us after death? And Jesus said, it's like, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it is placed in the ground, meaning going into death, then it comes to new life. So this image that is used both by Jesus and by Paul, I think, is the most helpful thing that we can have. Imagine, the beauty of, what are some of the famous flowers we have? Lilies, of course, and roses, yes. Tulips. What's another one? Oh, there's one type of a flower that has 35,000 varieties. Orchids. 35,000. Well, that's what it said. I get all this stuff from somebody saying it. I started counting, but then I got hungry. About 27,312, I got hungry, and so I said, "Oh, heck with it." So, but isn't that something? That's why when people do these things, with all this kind of stuff going on, they name them after themselves or their loved one or something like that. A lot of this was discovered by Augustinian priest Mendel back in the 1830s and 40s. That most of the major scientific advancements from the year 1200 on were by priests. There's, I think, 35 moons, or I should say craters on the moon that are named after Jesuit priests, because they're astronomers. They name after themselves, Okay. Now what we're going to do is turn the page. You can see how complex this is, but it's good for our friend Felix Hughes to put all this together, because this is his style. I like this style, because what it does is it gives kind of structure to things. He says resurrection appearance stories. The risen Jesus appears to various people, and so he puts them down: Matthew 28, Luke 24, John 20, and John 21, and then in the Acts of the Apostles. Now see how it says Mark in brackets from 16, 9 to 18. See how they have that in brackets? That's because that is suspect. That's the passage we didn't read. That's bogus. Not the material. I mean, the materials, but it's just taken from other gospels and put on. So anyway, then he has an ascension narrative, ascends being taken up to heaven, only in Luke 24 and in Acts 1, but not in Matthew, John, or the first edition of Mark. A brief mention in Mark's gospel is part of a later ending. Contrast. So anyway, let's go to the overview of the resurrection accounts in the four gospels. You can see that there is a sequence. This came about at the Vatican Council back in the 1960s. That the themes and conversations of all the different people putting together documents, they had 16 testaments that came out of there. You know, like I've mentioned several times, the document on the church is where you would find material about Mary, because Mary is the church. Mary is the representation of the church, God's people. So they don't have a separate document for her. Some of the Mariologists were very offended, said, oh, no, she deserves somewhere. No, she doesn't. Her proper place is there. So anyway, they have all these documents. But one of the major themes that came out was we should have more emphasis on the resurrection than on the crucifixion. Now that sounds, I don't mean to be crude about this. It sounds like, oh, you're putting down, you know, the fact of the crucifixion. No, not at all. But if you go to the Middle Ages, you will find more of the crosses and crucifixes and other pictorial representations of the crucifixion as being who Jesus is. And that's certainly true. I have no question about that. I may have told you back in August 8th, some years ago, I'm going to say probably about 10, 15 years ago, I was with my friends in Belgium, and I wanted to go down to see some other things. So I had a little car, and my friend had a little map. He's a banker, but he really knows his roads well. He says, here's where you go. You go all the way down to the southeastern part of Alsace-Lorraine. And they have in a town there a convent. And the convent was in the 1500s a hospital for people with skin diseases. And so they asked for a painter by the name of Grunewald to come in and to paint a portrait of Jesus crucified in this hospital for people with skin diseases. So the body on the cross is horrifying. The thing that catches your attention right away, you might have seen this painting, if not, go home and look at Grunewald. And the hands are like twisted out like this, you know, the nails are in here, so the hands are twisted like this, just in agony, reaching up to heaven. Oh my God. And down below you have Mary on one side and John the Baptist on the other side, and then the crowds of people and stuff like that. And but the body is kind of a grayish body, and it looks like little pinpricks coming out of it, like a little barbs coming out of the skin and stuff like that. So you kind of get a feeling, even by just talking about it, don't you get a feeling like this is not, you know, the pristine crucifix like we have upstairs, you know, with there's no wounds on it as such. You know, it's a beautiful representation, but this process of crucifixion was horrifying. So in doing this, what they're telling us is that Jesus, in the documents of the Vatican Council, should pay attention. We should pay attention to the resurrection. So all of a sudden, huge numbers of books and scholars and stuff like that start. All the books now are on the resurrection. And what they found was, you know, the more we study the resurrection, the more we find out this is not like the other gospel passages where we have, you know, some of Mark ends up in some of Matthew, and some of Mark ends up in some of Luke, and they're parallel. For example, the only thing that appears in all four gospels, I suppose, would be the crucifixion and other type things. But even the Eucharist is not mentioned in all four, because John has the washing of the feet instead, and Paul has this is what they did on the night before Jesus' death. And so you have four accounts of it there. But the only miracle that they have out of the 40 miracles, the only one that's in all four gospels is the multiplication of the bread. And so the gospels, I'm saying, I have a varying accounts of things like that they pay attention to according to their mode of understanding. So when it came to the resurrection, people try to put it all together. Well, you can't. You've got Mark with no appearance as such. You got Matthew with an appearance to Mary Magdalene in the disciples not understanding. Luke, you got Mary Magdalene and these other people. And and then, of course, in John, you get Mary Magdalene and the first, and then you got the two, the beloved disciple and Peter go down to the tomb, and then they go up to Galilee, and they're out fishing, and they meet Jesus there. And so you've got all kinds of things. How do you put all that together? So you can't. So what you really have is four traditions of the resurrection. And so that's what this And so what he has here, it says, comparison of the empty tomb. And then I'm going to the right-hand side to the page again. This is page 9. You get Matthew and Luke and John, Mark up on the top. You know, this is the appearance of the tomb. And then the ascension narrative of both Luke and Acts of the Apostles. So this is all laid out for us by this Father Felix Just. And it has on the back side then of this page, because we've got some other things to talk about too. Can you find letter G there? Questions for reflection and discussion? Yeah. And you see the little arrows put in there? Yeah, well, I did that. Do the empty tomb stories prove the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead? No. The empty tomb doesn't tell you Jesus rose from the dead. It just tells you the tomb is empty. That's it. If that's all there was just an empty tomb, like facetiously we call ourselves toomites instead of the believers in the resurrection. So, what is the significance of the different descriptions of the messenger in each of the empty tomb stories? Well, you know, we're left with the fact that they seem to be heavenly. It's not like somebody from down the street or somebody you'd recognize. They seem to be heavenly people in one fashion or another. In one case, there's one. In another case, there's two. What's the significance of the different number of names of the women in each of the empty tomb stories? Well, as I mentioned, there's a lot of women that are really devoted to Jesus, and they appear in each one of these. So Luke has his own sources because one of the women that he announces is married to a guy who was in Herod's government. Oh my. What's the most important difference between the empty tomb stories and appearance stories? Well, obviously, that's so obvious. Why did they even make that question? If it's an appearance, then you're actually meeting the risen Lord. What's the implication of the lack of any appearance story in the original version of Mark? Well, you've heard my explanation, which is the gospel has a theme in it of lack of understanding until everything is complete. And so what you need to do, because they haven't seen Jesus yet risen, what you need to do is to do with what he told you, go to Galilee and meet him there. Where do the appearance stories take place in Matthew? Well, in Matthew, the appearance story is on a mountain in Galilee, where in Luke, he sticks with Jerusalem. All the things in Matthew's gospel, or Luke's gospel, appear in Jerusalem. He's the only one that has Jesus at the age of 12 going to Jerusalem. Well, we do have a few minutes left here. And so I just want to show you some of the material I gave that we could read. Were you in the mindset? I came across this poem. You recall when this the tragedy of the rocket ship Challenger. I remember being in school on that day and having to tell students over the PA, you know, something terrible's happened, turn on the TVs in your room because it shot, you know, they had a teacher that was one of the women and went up and you could see it and everybody's ooh and ah and stuff like that. And all of a sudden it starts to veer, you know, and so they're saying, oh my God, what's happening? Then all of a sudden, you see it's falling apart, it's crashing. Oh my God. So on the back side of this page of this poem, which I'm going to come back to, it says AmericanRhetoric.com, Ronald Reagan had to speak, and this is what he spoke. He says, I plan to speak to you tonight about the State of the Union, but today's a day of mourning and remembering. He says, 19 years ago to the day we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident. He says, but we've never lost an astronaut in flight. And actually he says, perhaps we forgot the courage that it takes. He says, but we mourn these heroes, but we're not going to give up. He says, we're not going to give up. We're not going to stop the thing. So anyway, Christian McAuliffe. So what he does was he quotes the last line of this poem. Now this poem is written on the previous page there by a man named John McGee, who was Canadian. And he wrote this poem in several different ways, but this seems to be the best one. And he was born in China of missionary parents and went to school in England, and then joined the Royal Air Force. And sadly, he died in a plane crash sometime after he wrote this. So they found it in his paper. It says, "Oh, I slipped the surly bonds of earth, danced the skies on laughter silver winged, sun where I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things. You've not dreamed of wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence, hovering there. I've chased this shouting wind along, flung my eager craft through the footless halls of air. Up in the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark nor eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." Isn't that beautiful writing? Talk about going down the halls, the footless halls of air. So, but you're kind of in a hallway and you're kind of floating along with the wind behind you. That's just absolutely beautiful. Actually, I think it was one of the President Reagan's office staff came in and said this would be, if you're going to talk to people, use these phrases. Then there's another commentary on that. On the back side, I have something from one of our own Carmelites who was from Joliet, by the way, as were a number of others, and eventually got a doctorate from University of Notre Dame. You can do that. And became a professor in Washington. So he's got this kind of Catholic imagination, and the headline there, "The World as Sacrament." And it's actually the truth that I thought this. He says, I did hear of a church that had a vial with a murky substance. The church claims the vial contains part of the darkness of Good Friday, even though claims may be quite creative. Our imagination is helping us remember the nearness of God. Perhaps it would take a forest to produce all the relics of the true cross found in churches and shrines. Nevertheless, the devotion they engender is sincere and real. So this is the Catholic imagination, is to see God around us. You can see God in practically everything. Walking over one day, I saw a beautiful moth walking on the sidewalk. And I was just overcome, with the awesomeness of all these things. When you take the human imagination in our mind, and you say, how do we remember things? Well, that's a very intriguing question. How do we remember things? They can't be tangible things that are like in our brain cell or something like that, but it is a memory that comes back to us of things we have seen or heard or lived. And where did that come from? Well, because we experienced the event. But how does your brain store that? I mean, what compartment does it get put in? What physiological impact does it have on us? Neurological, things can connect. Or now in dotage, we can lose sight of things. As I say, why did I come into this room? So I just find that unanswerable into clarity. That scientists can do that. I took a course. I do these things on tapes just over the summer on the origin of the world through chemistry. It did not get into the origin of the world through scripture, which was, that God created us. It started off with the Big Bang, but it did not want to touch the question. Where did the stuff in the Big Bang come from? Must have been awesome, to fit under your fingernail, but look at this, a billion, trillion stars that have generated from that in a little power energy package. How can that possibly be? Then they say they can go back to 380,000 years of the universe exploding, from the big, well, how come they can't go any further? Because the light of the explosion of the Big Bang was so bright that the machine couldn't record it, couldn't get back through it. So but I'm thinking, if they're saying that the universe is 13.5 billion years old, and they get stopped at the year 380,000, that doesn't, I'm not depressed by that or upset by it or something like that. They're saying, doggone it, why can't we, I'm just saying to them, And the fact that that light that I'm seeing up there, you say, oh, look at that star up there, isn't that beautiful? Yeah, well, that's not the star. That's the light that's coming from the star from 10 billion years ago. Oh, really? But you start to put all these things. So that's when somebody would write about the forces of nature and the beauty of nature and stuff like that. As Catholic imagination, I think they're exactly right, because what we see in creation is love itself exploring us in so many different ways, and in partial way, like with trees and flowers and things like that we talk about, with some sensitivity in animals, but they only have instinct. When you think that a honeybee leaves the hive and goes 2 miles and comes back and then does a little dance in the hive, and then a bunch of bees go out and follow the route to get out there to where this bee had been. So you say, well, hey, wait a minute, those bees go back 100 million years. I have upstairs a picture and of a bug that is encased in amber. You know how those things go. And so it's a bug, but the bug is 100 million years old. So it was a bad day for the bug, but a good day for us. Well, I looked at the driver's license. Well, the scientists did this. Now, wait till you hear the rest of it. This bug, and it's like a long beetle like this, and it's got a jaw, a regular jaw, you eat. And it's got another jaw underneath. And it's not connected with your thorax because it's not for swallowing. It's just another mouth. And it's got little hairs in it like this. Okay. This is our bug. We're good friends now. I mean, okay, we're here. And he's got these little things here like this. And the bug lives on one of these huge plants, like from Jurassic Park is the way that the article along with this told us about. So what are these giant plants? But this plant does not sow pollen like other plants do, like a dandelion or something that would flow about. And so it doesn't have a way to pollinate. Well, that's terrible because, then the tree's gonna, but what it does is it made a contract with this little bug. So this little bug walks along the plant and uses the developed second jaw here to grab stuff and bring it in. And then it flies off to another plant that is waiting receptively. And I don't want to get into the sex of all this because that's just, but anyway, so it gets there and deposits this, and we get a pollinated seed then that can fall into the ground and make another plant. Now that's 100 million years ago. The universe was that smart that it could actually help shape, something like this. I'm just astounded. So with that, we've finished our time here in astonishment. Maybe I'll bring my picture down next week. That is what it is. Yeah, so I'll bring the bug. Well, thank you again, Stephanie, for taking care of all the mechanics of things. We had our crowd of viewers, and we'll have our crowd of viewers from tonight. So look at this, and other people looking at it over the